paper that I've written, Jesus, Tithing and Communism. I would like to say at the outset, I am most definitely not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. However, I'm not an evangelical Christian either. I've come to the conclusion that evangelical Christianity is a counterfeit form of Christianity. But there is a very surprising connection between the teachings of Jesus Christ regarding the running of the church and the teachings of Karl Marx and Leon Trotsky regarding the running of the communist collective. So here's my paper, Jesus, Tithing and Communism. There is a surprising link between the teachings of Jesus Christ and the communist collective, as advocated by both Karl Marx and Leon Trotsky, namely that each of them placed power within the hands of a collective and are completely opposed to rule by a single man. Furthermore, whilst communism regards mankind as born inherently good, so that according to them only the debasing influence of capitalist forces supposedly corrupts young people, the Bible, on the other hand, regards mankind as born inherently sinful, which is known as the Christian doctrine of original sin, Psalm 51:5 and Romans 5:19. So both Christianity as well as the communism of Marx and Trotsky will agree that power ought to be held only in the hands of a corporate body of trusted men and never in one man. That's why communism is so opposed to kings or rule by kings. Now, in examining communist ideology, it's strange that the children of faithful communists, who were supposedly born without any imperialist corruption, and then grew up in a glorious communist state such as the present-day North Korea, would then become corrupt. Wouldn't it be obvious that the most liberated people in the world ought to be the North Koreans, who are the most free from supposed capitalist corruption? After all, there is only so much that you can blame on the power of the CIA and other supposed capitalist pigs. Wouldn't it make sense for the most enlightened communist in North Korea to be their leader, Kim Jong-un himself, he being third in the line of effective communist kings? Now, of course, this is not true, for recent communist leaders seem to be amongst the most evil and the most corrupt in world history, rivaled only by the Nazis and the very worst of the Roman emperors such as Nero. There was a general in North Korea who tried to overthrow the last Kim king, Kim Il-sung, and they lined up troops in a football stadium, and they tied this general to a stake and they slowly burnt him alive. There's also been reports of chemical agents being tested on Christians and their families who won't submit to kings. So they're put in a glass chamber, men, women, children, toddlers, even babies in arms, and then chemical agents are tested on the families to see how quickly they can be killed, and scientists with little clipboards would take notes to see how quickly these people who won't worship these Kim kings take to die. That's the state of communism in North Korea. It is for this reason that those on the extreme left are forever attending and organising endless committees and other dull meetings, as power in the hands of a committee is the only real alternative to one-man rule by tyrants such as Mao, Stalin and the North Korean Kims. I recall a humorous British TV series from the 1970s, Citizen Smith, which summed up this situation very well. Mr. Smith, also known as Citizen Smith or Wolfie, was a member of a lunatic communist collective of only about 6 people in the middle-class South London borough of Tithing, which has the intention of taking over the entire British state by a mass revolution of the people. But being a Trotskyite communist, he, Wolfie Smith, was also in favour of rule by collectivism, i.e. by committee, rather than one-man autocratic rule, which was against his communist ideals. However, the fun of this series for Citizen Smith was that in every episode, Wolfie Smith always ended up steamrolling the other members of the Communist Committee and then bullying his comrades, so that he, Wolfie Smith, always ended up as a little Stalin himself, i.e. he never practiced what he preached. That was the humour of the series. Now, as I recall these episodes, I'm drawn to similarities between communism and Christianity. For God expressly warned Israel not to ask him for a king, as these kings would then abuse their power and their rule over the people. See 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 5 to 19. Nevertheless, Israel completely ignored God's advice by demanding from him a king, and then they consequently got precisely what God had warned them about. Thus, in contradiction or contradistinction in the New Testament, each congregation was to be ruled by a plurality, couldn't say the word, of male elders. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 17. In the New Testament, we never have one-man bands or one ruler over an entire Christian congregation. It is always a plurality. The idea that you have a pastor in charge of a church comes from the reformers deciding to retain the Roman Catholic idea that you have a priest in charge of a church. And this priest is supported by money, by the congregants who attend his meetings. Paul always used the plural with regard to appointing elders. Titus chapter 1 verse 5, and see also Acts 14:23. So the modern evangelical tradition of having a single pastor in charge of a congregation is not scriptural. In fact, the word pastor is only used once, and it refers to a gift and not to a title or to an office. So any elder who does his job well qualifies as a pastor, somebody who's caring for the flock. Ephesians chapter 4 verses 8 to 12. But there is no office of pastor. There's no one who's appointed as the pastor of a congregation who's over the elders and over the deacons, and he's the sole person in charge. That is unscriptural. And most of the problems in the modern evangelical church come from the fact that we do not have churches that are run by a plurality of elders, each of those elders holding equal power, which, as I have pointed out, is the same idea on which the communist collectives are run. There are several reasons why God has ordained that congregations are to be run by a plurality of elders, each of whom always has equal authority. So we don't have one-man band pastors in charge, steamrolling everybody else and bossing people around, and then consequently, of course, receiving all the tithes, so that it's the pastor who has the house paid for by the church. It's the pastor who has the big car paid for by the church. And then you have nepotism, when the pastor's son, who maybe is a very ungodly person, gets to 19, 20, the pastor says, well, the Holy Spirit has called him to a ministry. So the pastor gets his son into a paid position with the church. Nepotism. And then the son becomes the next pastor. One reason for the necessity of corporate male leadership within a church is that a man submitting to another man is the underlying basis of the homosexual act. Thus, God has ordained that men and women within a congregation are only to submit to a corporate body of elders and never to one man with the fancy title of priest or pastor, etc., etc. Now please, I am not attempting to argue that a Baptist pastor or an Anglican priest, by nature of his religious title, is therefore promoting homosexuality or the gay lifestyle within a congregation. Please do not misquote me. However, what I am pointing out is that what we are seeing today is that some of the worst evangelical churches, and particularly within the black African American evangelical churches, is the pastor as a single dominant alpha male who possesses most or all of the power in that congregation and who also lives entirely off the tithes. In other words, the church is his private fiefdom. You see, in the book of Acts, real Christians had all things in common. Acts 2:44. There was a daily ministration of food to those who were in need. Acts chapter 6. Look at the start of Acts chapter 6. But today it's different. Today, not in every church, but in many churches, the tithe is a private fiefdom for the pastor. He lives off the tithe. It is for his exclusive use. And so whereas in the first century, money and food that was given was then distributed amongst those who worked in the church. They were first in the queue, but also amongst the widows, orphans, and the infirmed, and the aged. Today, the churches don't seem to care about the poor. In fact, if you're poor and you go to a church, they'll exploit you. They will often say you need to pay a tithe because they just want to get money off you. They don't help you as they did in the first century church. They don't help the poor. They don't help the weak. They don't help the orphans and the widows. They exploit them. They say, even though you're a widow, even though you're on welfare or on a minimum wage job, you need to pay your tithe. And then the tithe goes to support the pastor for his Mercedes car and for his big house paid for by the church. This happens again and again and again, and it seems that the African American churches are by far the worst. Now, gradually, over time, this pastor evolves into an alpha male who must bully the other weaker males within that congregation into submission in order to maintain his own superior rank, status, and especially his right as the exclusive benefactor of church tithes. In fact, I've heard of several pastors, particularly megachurch and African American pastors, who just act like alpha male lions within a pack by dominating and subjugating the other less dominant males within that pride of lions. So can you see how the pastors, they act like the alpha male lion within a pack? Who's the only male lion who has sex with the female lions in a pride of lions? It's the alpha male. The other males have to be submissive. And it's the same thing within a church. It's the same thing within many evangelical churches. The pastor is the alpha male. He lives off the tithes. The church and the money in the church is his own private fiefdom. And if you're a male and you go to that church, then you have to learn to be a catamite. A catamite is the submissive partner in the homosexual act. That's effectively what you have to do. You have to bend over and let the pastor do what he wants.